Como entender e fazer uma análise mais justa do Brasil, não olhando apenas o presente, mas os últimos 30 anos? Na opinião do professor Robert Kaufman, da Universidade Rutgers de Nova Jersey, é importante entender que o Brasil foi uma ditadura. Hoje vive numa democracia, que antes convivíamos com a hiperinflação, hoje temos uma economia estável. E que sim, é uma democracia evoluída porque tem poderes independentes e imprensa livre. E que fazer comparações é até normal para as pessoas, e olha que fazemos várias, mas que é importante notar que problemas domésticos exigem soluções domésticas. Professor Kaufman, could you please tell us about your impressions about Brazil in this special moment? Because we had the two last years in Brazil were very important. In 2013, we had lots of protesters who went to the streets to complain about everything. Last year, we had a World Cup and a general election. Do you think Brazil is running well?
Brazil is going through a very bad moment right now. I mean, There's no doubt about it. I thought that the protests in 2013 were a wake-up call in a number of ways. In the first place, although people from all sorts of backgrounds were involved in the protests, the people in the streets were predominantly from the middle class. And that reflected, I think, a huge demographic shift in Brazil. Depending on how you define middle class, Brazil is perhaps now 40 or 50% middle class, a much larger middle class than ever before in Brazil. We don't know what they want. I mean, the social science is only guessing at what they want.
Oh, really?
I think from the protests there was a strong sense that people were dissatisfied with public services. It was triggered by bus fare protests over bus fare increases, but that very quickly mushroomed into a much broader set of complaints about schools, about the health system, about corruption. Certainly people were outraged at what they saw as police brutality. So at a very fundamental level, Brazil faces a challenge of responding to the needs of this changing population. And up till now, they've struggled. Brazil has struggled. Mm-hmm. So that's only one of the problems, but I think it is indicative of a range of problems that Brazil is facing right now.
About middle class is going to the street to complain about everything. Is that good or bad? Because in the recent history in Brazil, a lot of social scientists in Brazil used to complain about the middle class is not interested in the country because they have more money, they have access to anything, so they don't need to support the state. Do you think it's good or bad? You have more people complaining, a middle class, the upper class, the low
One of the good things about Brazil is it's a democracy.
Exactly.
Not a very always a very efficient or effective democracy, but it is a democracy. And I think that people protesting in the streets is part of the democratic process, as long as it's peaceful. I think in that sense it's a good thing. I mean, people are expressing demands. It also, though, I think reflects a kind of an alienation, that people in the streets are in the streets because they don't have confidence that the political parties represent them effectively. Mm-hmm. They don't have confidence that the institutions like Congress or elected officials represent them. And so this was also a sign of problems for Brazil, of alienation, of upsetment with the system. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the protest was the rejection of parties. Mm-hmm. That the PT and other parties went out in the street and they were, sometimes violently, usually not, rejected, told to go home.
What's the level of democracy do you think Brazil is living now? Because if on one hand we have a democracy, people can complain about everything, they can go to the streets to do this. On the other hand, we don't have enough public service in health, education. In what level democracy Brazil is?
I think that we have to be careful about what our expectations about any democracy is.
Yeah.
The United States is not...
We're not exceptions about democracy.
The United States, my country, is not functioning at all well.
Oh, good.
Europe is terrible, in a terrible shape.
Yeah.
So, I think that you have to kind of put Brazil in a broader perspective. And in that sense, I think its democracy has all the defects of other democracies. It doesn't respond well to the demands of the citizens. There's a lot of corruption. I don't know very many democracies that don't have those problems. So I actually think that Brazil does pretty well by sort of general realistic standards of what a democracy is supposed to be. It doesn't mean it does well. It just means it does adequately, I think.
Have you already heard about that sense that Brazilians think God is Brazilian, like then, and Brazil is the country of the future? But people are complaining. Exactly. But people are complaining now in the present. Is that what do you opinion about this lock? This gap of expectation in time, because
again, I mean, Brazil is realistically passing through a very hard moment. I mean, we all know that. I mean, its economy is stagnant. It's facing huge structural adjustment problems. Its government has serious fiscal difficulties. I mean, all of these things, it has huge problems of security. I mean, there are lots of problems. Well, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
I look at this, I've been studying Latin America and studying Brazil since the 1960s. I mean, I go way back. I've been visiting Brazil since that time. And so from my perspective, in spite of the fact that Brazil is having a terrible time right now.
I know.
And there's a lot of anguish about it. That if you look at it over the last 50 years, since the 1960s, since I've been working on studying Brazil, the overall trajectory has been quite positive. When I went to Brazil, you had secret police, you had press censorship, you had a dictatorship. When during the 1980s, when you finally had civilian government in the early 1990s, all of us political scientists were shaking our heads and saying Brazil is hopeless, it's ungovernable, it'll never, it'll always be wild inflation and well, that didn't happen, right? I mean, the inflation was tamed.
In that time, there was no solution, but...
There was no solution.
Oh, really?
Well, there was, of course, as we now know, there was.
Exactly.
I mean, politics and the economy stabilized sometime around Fernando Henrique Cardoso, 1995.
Exactly.
And there were real gains, I thought, under Cardoso. I think Cardoso, by the way, is not fully appreciated for his achievements in Brazil. I think he was a major president, a great president, because he did turn the corner for Brazil in many ways, or he not alone, but his administration. I think that when the PT started to gain votes, and when Lula was campaigning in, when was that, 2002?
Exactly, yeah.
People were saying, oh my God, this is the end of Brazil. It's the apocalypse. I used to go and be observer at this organization here in New York called the Council of the Americas, which is primarily a business organization. And the business people were saying, oh, there's going to be a meltdown, everything is going to crash.
I know.
Well, and I have to tell you, a political science, a Brazilian political scientist who's a friend of mine, who is not a fan of the PT, is, more PSDB.
I know.
She said during the campaign, she said, I'll make you a bet. I said, what is it? She said, if Lula wins, nothing will change. And
Really?
And in fact,
but did he say that in 2002?
Yeah,
Okay.
Before he won. And my point is this: that even in so the PT came, people were very nervous, very worried. The fact is that the PT has many faults, so do all the other parties, but it became the government. And my friend is maybe not completely right. It's not that nothing happened, but there was no crisis.
Exactly.
Things went along. There are many ways that Brazil grew and improved during that time under Lula. There were social programs that were successful. So
is that a signal of an adult democracy?
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, it was a sign that Brazil, could have competition, it could have conflict, it could have debates, could have elections where power changed hands, and that became normal.
I know.
Now it was never normal in Brazil. That was something in the past was, you never knew whether the person who won the election would be allowed to take office. So that's an enormous step forward for Brazil. You're asking me what kind of a democracy.
Exactly.
It's a normal democracy. I mean, it has all these problems, but so do most democracies. What is the sign of a working democracy, it seems to me, is when you have free elections, where the winner actually can take over the government without worrying about being overthrown.
I know.
Where people have civil liberties, where there's a free press, where there's an independent Congress. Courts are not so great in Brazil, but they're pretty independent.
Yeah.
That's a normal democracy.
I think the Supreme Court was more independent in the past, but nowadays there's a lot of complaints about this. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. But my point is this: that right now Brazil is going through a very hard time, and I mean I don't want to minimize the difficulties that Brazil is having. I think they face very serious problems. My point is only that they faced serious problems in the past, and have, where people have looked at Brazil and said, "Oh, things are terrible. We'll never get out of this out of this problem," and they do. And so my guess is that Brazil will, if it lives up to the historical record, will overcome the problems that it's facing right now. It won't overcome them perfectly.
Yeah,
but it'll overcome them.
Professor, my question now is natural for countries, for nations, or for young democracies like Brazil to make comparisons? Because we make a lot of comparisons. Yeah. We compare Brazil, Chile, with India, with South Korea in terms of education, health, public system, and of course, trade, especially trade. When the comparison is with Chile. Chile is more open, is an open market. So what do you think about this aspect in Brazil? Why we are quite closed?
Well, I mean, first of all, large economies tend to be more closed than small economies. I mean, that's just a natural pattern, that small economies are more dependent on trade. So if you compare Brazil with Chile, you're comparing a giant economy with a quite small economy that is clearly trade dependent. You can't expect Brazil to be like Chile. It's there's too big, it's too large a domestic market. It's never going to be as open.
But do you think it's a question of inefficiency or a question of choice to protect?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's both.
Both?
Yeah. I mean, the trend in public policy over the last, certainly during Dilma's mandate, and maybe earlier under Lula, the trend was away from a more open economy. So that it was deliberate at some level. It also, though, is a problem of inefficiency. I mean, you have ports that are, lessons in inefficiency.
Yes.
The trucks lined up for days and miles. You have airports that are in terrible shape. You have roads getting from the airport in Sao Paulo to the center of Sao Paulo is a adventure. It can take hours and hours. When I go to Sao Paulo, I never know, for example, when to leave for the airport, because I don't know whether it's going to take an hour and a half or 2 hours or 3 hours. So those are all, I think, structural problems. They're not problems of policy exactly, but they certainly impede the growth of exports.
Let's make a comparison, an internal comparison. If you look at the past, at the time of dictatorship, and now the democracy, we had a very fantastic achievement for people. Democracy is much, much better than any kind of dictatorship.
Right.
But if you look at the 80s in Brazil, the infrastructure was quite good for that time. Not the best, but quite good. If you look at now, the infrastructure in Brazil is terrible. If you look at the size of the country, the aspirations of the country, the ambitions of the country, why don't you think that we change this in the same?
Why isn't there?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I think that the fiscal priorities are an important part of the explanation for that.
The fiscal priorities.
Yes, I mean.
I know.
So you have huge amount of the budget being devoted to.
We are talking about the government accounting, yes.
I am, yes.
I know.
Devoted to pensions for the middle and upper middle class. I think that the Lula government, one of the good things it did was to start to direct some money to the poor segments of the population, but the bulk of social spending still benefits the upper and middle tier of Brazilian society. And it takes up a huge portion of the budget. There are other areas which are also very high expenditure areas. Now, if you, in a perfect world, you could reallocate some of that money in the direction of infrastructure, in the direction also not only of infrastructure, of education, of health, sort of human capital, Brazil would be much better off. But that's a very difficult, politically very difficult thing to do.
Let's talk about a very controversial issue in Brazil. It's Bolsa Família. Part of the population believe that Bolsa Família was fantastic because Bolsa Família brings some people from the poverty.
Right.
What's everything? Of course, this is good. But part of the population, and believe me, believe that these people is going out of the job, of the normal job. Because, I have some pension, I have some money from government, some benefit from government, so I don't have to work. It's this two parts of the people think differently, but about the same issue. It's a question of social issue, very important in a country like Brazil. It's a developing country with poverty and a lot of people.
Right, enormous poverty.
Exactly. Yeah. In your opinion, Bolsa Família is good or bad?
I think it's been a very good program.
Exactly.
First of all, it doesn't cost very much.
Yeah.
I don't have the latest statistic, but not more than about a half a percentage of the gross domestic product is what the expenditure is. So it's a very minor expenditure from the point of view of the government. I may be out of date on this. It may have gotten more, but not much more. It is very well targeted. There's very little evidence of corruption or clientelism or vote buying. So it's a very clean program politically. Gets to the people it's intended to reach. It's hard for me to think that it keeps people out of the workforce because you have one of the things you do have in Brazil is a very low unemployment rate. So people are employed. Now the big question in my mind about Bolsa Família, I think it helps poor families, and I think that's good. The big question is whether it will succeed in its other objective, and its other objective is to build human capital for the next generation. So the theory, as you know, of Bolsa Família is we're going to give you an allowance. You have to use that allowance to improve the education and the health of your children.
In this case, the country has to improve its education.
And so the question would be, is that generation going to be stronger, better in human capital than the present generation? I don't think we know yet the answer.
We do not have this answer now.
I think we need more information. I don't believe that we are necessarily negative. It's just I'm not sure. One of the problems is that the Bolsa Família increases the demand for schools, but it doesn't necessarily increase the supply of quality education. So a young person who's a beneficiary of the Bolsa Família may be going longer to school, but the schools may not be very good. So there has to be, I think, more action on the supply side of the educational story, of bringing better education to the people who are getting benefited from the Bolsa Família.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the Brazilian officials are ready to attend the new demands from the market, from the society? Yeah, I'm talking about people who work for government, in the ministries, the government. Do you think these people are ready? Talking about education, well-prepared labor force.
Yeah.
Because there's a big connection in Brazil. Everything, if you put Brazil in another reality, everything depends on the government in Brazil. All the time you needed to talk, what Brazil thinks about this.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
People are very focused on the
much more than in the United States.
Probably. I'm not sure about that, but probably. Yeah. They're very focused on the federal government here too. The federal government for the last 5 or 6 years has been pretty paralyzed. I mean, with the division between the president and the Congress, there has not been a lot achieved. To your question about whether people in the government are prepared, I'm not sure I can generalize about that. I think there are very competent people in the government, very, very competent people in the opposition, people who have a very public interest at heart. But politicians in Brazil are like politicians in most places. They also have personal ambitions that may not be well aligned with the public interest. So, political parties in Congress want control of patronage. They want campaign funds. They want to advance their own careers, and a lot of times that is counterproductive.
And do you think it's a great distance between what government does and what the society demands?
I think there is always a distance between what in any democracy.
It's not new in Brazil.
It's definitely not anything different in Brazil. I think that there is. It depends on who is making the demands. I mean, one of the things the last election showed, for example, was that low-income people in Brazil felt the government was doing well for them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they preferred Dilma to Aécio, and you know, if we respect their judgment, it's because they felt they were getting a better deal.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that's not the way people felt, you know, São Paulo in the south of Brazil. Where I think the government has fallen down, and it isn't only the PT, it also was the Cardoso and the government before, is that they're just struggling very hard to provide the population with first-class, first-world public services. The schools are terrible, terrible, the public schools. You were saying before at some point about the middle class, or quoting other people as saying the middle class have kind of opted out of the public system. That's absolutely true. You know, that a middle class person who of modest income, I'm not talking about the upper middle class, I'm talking about a modest income, will save and struggle to send their kid to, if they can, to a private school.
There's
why?
no future for them.
Huh?
With
Why?
this education, there's no future for them.
Yeah, if they do not send their kid to a private school, and they have to send them to a public school, they know certain things. They know this child will not be able to get into to pass the entrance test, the vestibular, to get into a decent university. So they've, in effect, opted out of the public school system. So those kinds of things are not meeting, you know, you're asking about what doesn't meet the needs. I mean, those kinds of things are really not meeting the needs of a very large and growing segment of the Brazilian population, the middle class. Mm-hmm. Now, in fairness, more poor kids are getting educated, more poor kids are getting access to medical care, but the quality is not very good. So a big challenge, this is a challenge all over Latin America, not only in Brazil, is to find some way to make public services acceptable to people as they move into the middle class. And Brazil hasn't been able to do that.
We talked about comparisons before, and let me make another comparison, another question about this. Is there any place, any country in the world that we can make a comparison with Brazil? So, because as I told you before, we love to make comparisons. Yeah, we make a lot of comparisons all the time. I don't know if it's fair or not.
It's reasonable.
Yeah. It's reasonable, but is there some place that, okay, that country has to be compared to Brazil because they did well. They did very well what they should did. They should done. So, in this terms, is there this place?
Is there a
South Korea?
A good Brazil. Well, let me think about that for a moment. Again, I don't mean to sound overly optimistic. I don't want to provide happy talk. But if you compare Brazil with the other BRICS, you know, if you compare it with India or Russia or South Africa,
but Russia's quite...
Or China.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Brazil, I would much rather live in Brazil than in any of those other countries. If you compare it with other big Latin American countries, Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, I mean, these are not countries that are compare favorably with Brazil. Now, it is the case that if you look at South Korea or Taiwan, those two East Asian countries, those seem to have a much better record. And I guess those are the countries that Brazil likes to compare itself to. I haven't been to Taiwan. I've been to Seoul. I've been to Korea.
I know.
And I have to say, I mean, I'm not an expert in East Asia. I didn't go outside of the capital. But I looked around the capital, and what I saw was everywhere I went fairly all over, people well-dressed, very clean, very free of crime, pretty efficient. And I thought to myself, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, these people that are walking on the street very well dressed and free of crime, their grandparents, or sometimes their parents, were living in huts in the countryside and with dirt floors. I mean, Korea was, 60 years ago, an incredibly poor country. And today, it's, as you know, gone beyond, way beyond Brazil. Not way beyond, but quite a bit beyond. And it's a democracy. So it certainly has problems, but it's doing well. What's its secret? And is it a fair comparison? I guess that's the question. I mean, if Brazil had only changed this or that, would it be like Korea? I think Korea had a number of factors that are impossible at this point for Brazil to emulate. It had a huge land reform back in the 1950s. And what that did was create a kind of a big rural middle class and compress income differences in a way that, Brazil was a land of fazendas and so in a certain sense it had an advantage over Brazil in that it began its development trajectory with a much more equal distribution of income. And Brazil has always been the reverse. And I think that's had a huge positive effect on Korea and a huge negative effect on Brazil.
We don't have any much more comparisons, so can I say our problems, our solutions? We have to find our solutions.
I think that's right. I think there are lessons that you can pull from other places. Not like there's those other comparisons are irrelevant, but Brazil, like any other country, has unique features, and that means that the solutions there's no recipe that they can just use to solve their problems. I think that Korea, there were things that you can learn from Korea. First of all, they did invest a lot in the education system. So from the very beginning, they had very great advantages in terms of skilled labor, human capital, that sort of thing. That's something that Brazil could do.
Professor Kaufman, my last question.
Okay.
What's your expectation about the new team in economy in Brazil, led by new finance minister Joaquim Levy?
I think it's a good sign. I think that the question in my mind during the election campaign was whether Dilma would, several years before, had a very reckless macroeconomic policy. I mean, she was moving in the direction of serious deficits and big inflation problem, not like it was in the 90s and the 80s, but worrying. So my question was whether she would, once she won the election, whether she would double down. By double down means it was just intensify her trajectory that she had adopted, or whether she would be pragmatic and start to kind of make adjustments. There are a lot of cases in Latin America where the incumbent doubled down. One good example of that is Cristina Kirchner. She would run into problems, and then instead of retreating, she would do even more of the things that were getting her into trouble. I don't know. I think we don't know yet about what Dilma will do, but I think her decision about who to appoint to run the macroeconomic policy is positive. Yeah.
I think I lied about my last question. Now it's my last question. Sorry.
That's okay.
Everyone in Brazil like to say, "Oh, we need to change. Brazil has to change. Brazilian government has to change." I don't know exactly what the change we're talking about, but this is like a sentence that people say a lot. "Oh, we need to change." Well, taking this like a true, okay, we need to change. Do you think Brazilian government fears or resisted to change, to look for a new time, a new moment for Brazil?
I think that the party in power, the PT, has been in power for a long time. This will be the fourth mandate, right? There's 2 Lula mandates and then now 2 Dilma mandates.
I know.
I think that the Lula government and the Dilma government have done some good things.
But,
well, I think that what is the case with any government, any party that's been in power for a very long period of time,
I know.
You get stale, you start doing the same things over and over. And it's healthy for a democracy. I want to be careful about this because I really don't want to, I think that the Brazilian politics are for the Brazilians, and I'm not a voter, so I don't have a say in this. But I think that when you talk about any democracy, there comes a time when if you have the same party over and over again, it's not good, and you need some kind of rotation. And well, the Brazilian voters decided this was not the time for change.
Okay. This is the change we're talking about.
But yeah, well, they didn't. I mean, they didn't change.
Exactly.
They voted. So, but I think that it is healthy over the longer run for Brazil to have new governments.
Professor Robert Kaufman, thank you so much for your interview.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.